This is one of the most epoch-making books in the first decade of this millennium. I made a full translation of it in 2001 when it appeared. Now, 20 years later, I feel the world is ready to read it. Therefore, I'm looking for a publisher. This is the blurb. I'll tell, I whispered. It was a promise, an oath, a damnation. Everything in one sentence. Someday I'll tell. I really would. This was something that couldn't be avoided. I'll tell the grown-ups, the teacher on playground duty at my school, the police, the prime minister. Anybody who was bigger than Gustav and who would see to it what he'd done to me would never, ever happen again. I'll tell. That was for sure, because now, from now on, I'd watch and remember, and then I'll tell it all. After my 3 years ordeal with Gustav, the paedophile, I was absolutely desperate for help. I was referred to the Copenhagen University Clinical Psychology Department. I filled in an application form and sent it off. In the space where I was to describe my problem, I simply wrote, "Seeing closure." I had attached 2 full pages that outlined my situation. The department told me, to begin with, we can offer you 2 weekly consultations of in-depth psychoanalysis over a period of 2 years. 2 years? I hadn't imagined that my situation was that bad. I'd imagined that this was something that would take a couple of months. This is the best we can offer. The very best would be full psychoanalysis, but this would take something like 5 to 7 years with a weekly consultation, and we can't offer you that. Then Alice took over. She was the psychoanalyst who for 2.5 years carried out the most intensive restoration work you can imagine. Like a medical consultant in a hospital ward, she would monitor my progress at close range week after week, slowly restoring my whole life. It was all done in a very strict framework. We would each sit in a purple chair, both facing a poster on her wall. We would speak about my mum, rolled joint of meat with prunes, pet shop boys, astrology, switchboards, Sanskrit, blonde pubic hair, my grandmother's hairnet, everything that goes on in a young man's life. While I spoke, Alice slowly closed in on the problem which I'd been searching for an answer to in vain. Once we talked about the fact that occasionally I was afraid of wetting my pants. After 2 months, I slowly began to trust my bodily functions and to take possession of my body again. It was quite a surprise to discover what it was all about. At one stage, I began to have some pretty strong fantasies about having sex with Alice. They just popped up one day. At first, it was a random thought that crossed my mind. But they turned into extremely vivid images of us together, albeit in a strange, hard manner. It was like watching a porn film, which whirled constantly at the back of my mind. This really bothered me. One day I plucked up courage, briefly touching upon the subject in a subordinate clause. "What is it you imagine?" she asked me, matter of fact. I told her in detail about my thoughts, about the images that just poured into my mind at the strangest hours of the day. I blushed terribly. began to gasp for breath and suddenly felt very unwell. I was awfully ashamed at telling her this sort of thing. It took me by complete surprise because I felt ashamed of my emotions. All of a sudden, I was confused. Alice just sat there in her purple chair, nodding quietly while she asked me all the details of how I imagined that I'd met her as equally much an Amazon, the Virgin Mary, a whore, and a teacher. She took me by complete surprise. She seemed interested and asked me many questions. As I lie there on the desk with my panties down, legs spread and very, very moist, what would you then do to me? She asked me calmly. I told her everything about the fantasies that had appeared. She made me describe how I imagined the sounds she would utter while we had intercourse. I was just so terribly ashamed. How do you feel when we talk about these things? She then asked me calmly. With our combined efforts, we slowly discovered that I'd been absolutely terrified of telling her about my fantasies because deep down I didn't trust her one bit. I was unbelievably scared of her reaction because although she had told me that of course I could tell her everything, I didn't imagine that I could. Shortly after discussing my fantasies, I began to talk with Alice about some of the emotions and thoughts which ever since my childhood I'd kept secret to my family and friends, and which all through my life I'd never imagined I would speak about to any living soul. We also talked about violence, slit throats, liquidations at close range, strangulation, poisoning. Occasionally, I would be utterly lost in houses which suddenly, and for no reason at all, just burnt down, right down. Alice taught me to enter my anger without it destroying me, and by focusing on and analyzing my fantasies for a very long period of time, I finally managed to free myself from their iron fist.